Okay, we are here to talk about the 18th century in America, but before we do, I know you're tired of the Puritans, but it's really important that we are clear about some aspects of the history and philosophy with them, so that we have a better sense of what the colonists of the 18th century were, I guess, sort of reacting against. So, just a little bit more before we get to them. We will, I promise. Okay, so the Puritans, if we're going to talk about their worldview, they look at pretty much everything, operations of nature around them, individual actions, their own and others, and also the building of the nation that they're, the city on the hill, all of that. They see all of that as a result of God's direct handiwork. So, it didn't work out. There were problems. From the beginning, there were dissenters such as Roger Williams, again, who was sympathetic to the natives and preached a more tolerant approach. And then Anne Hutchinson with her antinomian beliefs, she was also banished from the group. And at the same time, well, shortly after they started getting set up as a colony, there was a time called the Great Migration between 1629 and 1640, where a huge influx of people showed up to the colony, and it was a mix of Puritans but also non-Puritans. And that meant the Puritans, they got very anxious about this because they didn't like any outsiders with differing beliefs and values, I guess, sort of making their community impure. So that led to more and more anxieties and tightening up and doubling down on restrictions. In fact, it was actually illegal. It was banned for non-married men to live in the Puritan community if they weren't like a member of if they weren't married to a woman and kind of part of the Puritan community, they were not allowed to live there, or they'd get fined because they just didn't want these roughnecks, coming from overseas to come in there and, make things impure. So that was definitely an issue. And then, daggone it, I am stuck again. Hold on. Okay, sorry about that. I don't know why that keeps happening. A little bit more about the halfway covenant and issues caused by that. So you'll recall that Puritans had almost impossibly strict standards about who could be admitted to their church community and who was an official member. And remember, they believed that it had already been decided ahead of time whether somebody was saved or not. And so it was all about, sort of proving to other members that yes, you were saved. God had told you you'd have to do your conversion narrative, and it didn't really allow for the possibility of future generations and how it was going to work with them. There wasn't really a plan for the future. They hadn't thought that far ahead. So what ends up happening is it's not guaranteed that just because your parents were members of the church that you would be too. And so the compromise was this thing called the halfway covenant. It was promoted by Solomon Stoddard. That's going to be important later because his grandson, Jonathan Edwards, is going to go on to do the sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. So just put a pin in that. The whole idea was to maintain some of the church's influence as older members were dying out. And it allowed for partial church membership for the children and grandchildren of church members. It allowed them to be baptized in the church and take part in the Lord's Supper, but they could not take communion or vote on church matters. So it was a lot of church oversight and commitment in their lives without all the full benefits of being a member. So partial member, they believed okay, if we just expose them to the possible benefits of being a member of the church, then they'll get excited and have their own conversion experience and then can become officially full members. It just, it didn't take, though. It didn't work out too well. Oh, darn it. Boy, oh boy. Let's hope that doesn't keep going on. All right. Halfway covenant. It received a negative response. It didn't have the positive response they were expecting. As to be expected, some of the old school devout religious members felt, okay, that's watering it down. We can't be doing that. We're Puritans after all. We need to be pure. They didn't think it fully adhered to the church's guidelines that they had basically fought so hard to have for so long. And then those who were targeted by this compromise weren't super impressed by it. They just decided, we'll just wait. We won't go through all this rigmarole. We'll wait for the true conversion experience. If it's going to happen, it'll happen. If not, it won't. So no sense in doing all this really strict Puritan lifestyle stuff until that happens. And this may have actually sown the seeds for something that's going to happen later, known as the First Great Awakening, which was in the 1730s. Solomon Stoddard's grandson, Jonathan Edwards, was one of the people who launched that. So basically these things have a way of kind of pendulum swinging back and forth, right? I mean, it's when a religious community is too, I guess, strict or stringent, then that tends to have the impact of future generations becoming a little less devout and a little less strict, or a lot less devout, a lot less strict in response. But then in response to that, people are like, oh, we need to go back to the old ways, the better ways, the traditions, to a more fundamentalist approach. So it goes back and forth and always does. So that was the swing back to the more fervent religious way of looking at things. And then of course the witch trials were a huge ink blot on their history. It was a huge embarrassment and really the culmination of a failed society in a lot of ways. This happened in the 1690s. It really marked the end of their reign. No one ever took them seriously again after this, despite the efforts of guys like Cotton Mather. During this time, over 150 people were arrested and imprisoned. Even more than that were accused, but they weren't necessarily formally pursued by authorities, but over 150 people were. All 26 who actually went to trial before the court were convicted of the capital felony, that means punishable by death, of the crime of witchcraft. Now, obviously, there were no real witches during this time. I mean, we could talk about why, people thought this was happening, or whether they even really did think it was happening, whether it was just an excuse for other behavior. I don't know. You'll have to read The Wonders of the Invisible World for yourself and see what some of the explanations were given after the fact for these convictions. So 19 of the accused, 14 women, 5 men, were executed for the crime of witchcraft by hanging. An older man named Giles Corey, who had been accused and imprisoned, he refused to plead guilty to the crime of witchcraft because he said, well, I'm not guilty of it. And so basically to try to extract a confession out of him, they put a board on top of him and piled it with really heavy rocks until he was basically crushed to death. And he went to his grave cursing everyone in attendance, as I probably would too. So not terribly dignified behavior on the part of the Puritans. Pretty gross. And 5 more of the accused who weren't executed died in prison awaiting trial because the conditions were pretty abhorrent. There's actually a video in the corresponding videos folder that I think y'all might enjoy. It's actually it was a free-for-all project from one of my face-to-face classes many years ago, so be kind in your estimation of the video quality. But it's back when I allowed group projects, which we can't do in an online class, but back then they were allowed, and this group made, I think, a pretty good video about the witch trials where they reenact one of the trials. So it's definitely worth a watch. It's kind of funny in some places too, believe it or not. So I hope you enjoy it. They worked very hard on it, so I like getting to show it. Oh boy. Well, this is just getting downright annoying, these little glitches. The 18th century. All right, bye-bye Puritans. Okay, they kind of phased out of existence. Now we're moving on to a different era in American history. So just to be clear, when we say the 18th century, we're talking about the 1700s. I know that can be confusing because you see 18th and you think 1800s, which would make sense, but no, it's the 1700s. Okay, just want to be clear about that. Now we are going to talk about the 1800s, but not for quite a while. So just sit tight and we'll get there. So what changed during the 18th century in America? So much. There were massive demographic changes and because of an influx of immigrants, basically, colonists coming from all over the place, settling in different areas, setting up different communities. So there was a lot more diversity demographically than there were during the time of the Puritans, for sure, which was, as the name suggests, quite homogenous. Massive economic changes as well, and that's going to be important to take into account, but we'll talk more about that later. And then massive political changes too. So this is the period of the Enlightenment, which is, we'll talk more about that as a philosophical movement, because it's important to understand how that influenced, the thinking of authors during the time. And then this would eventually lead to revolution, our next unit. The American Revolution. Maybe you've heard of it. Okay, some more about the demographic changes. So there was massive population growth during this time. People were living much healthier lifestyles. They weren't crammed into, filthy city, basically back in Europe, where everyone's kind of, when you have people in really close quarters, and you don't have good sanitation practices, when you have people and animals and all kind of, trash and who knows what else, all kind of piled together, it really is obviously a breeding ground for illness and plague, particularly for children. So once these colonists got to the Americas, there's lots of room to spread out. There's a much more varied diet than they would have had in Europe. And so just overall, they're living much, much healthier lifestyles and living through childhood to adulthood and beyond much more often than they would have back in Europe. Also migration from Europe, a lot of that happening as well. So you've got lots more people being born and surviving and moving there. Also, this is when slavery began to, well, it wasn't the beginning of slavery in America, but I mean, we already know that was already happening in New Spain centuries before. But over the course of the century, over 275,000 slaves were imported from Africa over that time. So that's going to really change things as well. So again, this is leading to increased diversity. Half of the English colonies are now non-English. That's a big deal. So all of this is actually especially important when you read Sarah Kemble Knight's travel journal, what she was experiencing. She does actually mention slaves, and not in a very nice way. She's constantly talking about the different people that she's encountering and like different towns and how they dress and how they talk and their different customs. And it's really interesting. She definitely has some judgments about all those things. She's not always kind, but she's got a really keen eye for detail, and she's really interested in describing the things she sees around her and commenting on them, either favorably or unfavorably. So the non-English settlers in that region are primarily Scotch, Irish, German, and Dutch. And she encounters, I believe, all of those in her travels, because she has to travel a great distance in New England to do her business. Okay, just to give you a sense of the massive explosion of population growth during the 18th century, I've got this chart here for you that I made, just because I think talking about it is one thing, seeing it is another. So you get over here the population 1650, which is just a drop in the ocean compared to by the time we get to 1790, which is at 3.5 million people. So that over the course of a century, we have literally millions of people coming into play that weren't there before. So it's a really exciting and crazy time in American history. All right, economic changes. There was a rise in the living standard. There's just more to go around than there was in Europe. And so people are not as hand to mouth in their living. They've got more money to spend on non-essentials. So that's a change. This is really only true for those who own land and who have money. The price of land actually went up during this time because there's more people and less of it to go around, and we know how that works. And this actually ends up sending more people into the cities, and that's going to be a really important part for understanding revolutionary thinking and writing and the context for that, because you're going to have more people in a concentrated area talking about ideas and reading pamphlets and literature and listening to each other speak in town squares and at taverns and things like that. So that revolution really couldn't have happened without that high concentration. Okay,